Today, we're wrestling with a really complex figure.
Absolutely. One of the most contradictory and, you could argue, defining figures of the American Gilded Age, Andrew Carnegie.
Hmm.
Our mission today is to analyze all this source material, the biographies, the financial records, the accounts of, real tragedy, to try and understand the man behind the myth.
And it's an essential mission. Because when you look at Carnegie, you're not just looking at a successful businessman.
Yeah.
You're looking at the embodiment of America's economic paradox. Our sources, they really present us with two completely different men.
It's like Jekyll and Hyde.
It really is. On one hand, you have the almost saintly philanthropist, and on the other, the brutal industrial tyrant. We've got to synthesize these two extremes and figure out, for you, the listener, what was the true cost of the transformation he brought to the nation.
And the scale of that transformation, let's just unpack that right out of the gate. We're talking about a man who built a fortune so immense that when he sold his company, his personal net worth was a staggering 2% of America's entire gross domestic product.
That statistic is, it's just so hard to wrap your head around in modern terms.
It really is.
I mean, wealth is so much more dispersed today. Back in 1901, that level of concentrated wealth meant one man controlled resources equivalent to what the entire American economy produced in, 73 days?
73 days. That's incredible power.
It's immense political, social, and industrial power, far more than even the wealthiest people hold today.
And to put that into a historical perspective, our sources show that when historians adjust these fortunes, based on their share of world GDP.
Which is really the only fair way to compare across centuries.
Right. When they do that, Carnegie actually ranks higher than his famous contemporaries, John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan.
He does. Among all businessmen, absolutely. And in the overall history of wealth, if you adjust for the economic scale of the time, he is ranked fourth.
Fourth ever.
Fourth ever. He's only surpassed by, ancient emperors like Caesar Augustus or figures like Mansa Musa. So we're analyzing the financial firepower of one of the richest human beings who has ever lived. That's the magnitude of what we're trying to dissect here.
So we have this core duality, this central conflict wrapped up in one man's life. How did a Scottish immigrant with only 5 years of formal schooling rise from literally abject poverty to this kind of global wealth, only to be branded, at the same time, the world's greatest philanthropist and a ruthless tyrant?
And that tension really defined the Gilded Age, didn't it? This extraordinary progress that was built upon extraordinary human exploitation.
Exactly.
So to understand Carnegie's role in that, we need to explore three critical phases. First, his early life, which, is really what instilled his ambition.
That's the foundation.
Second, the ruthless business strategies he used to build the steel empire. And finally, the colossal and, let's be honest, controversial philanthropy he used to dispense that wealth and maybe cleanse his name.
Okay, that's our mission for this deep dive. Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
To really grasp the intensity of Carnegie's ambition, we have to start at the absolute bottom. His life story begins in Dunfermline, Scotland in 1835, and he was born into deep poverty.
But it wasn't just static poverty. This was poverty born of sudden violent obsolescence, and that distinction is key.
What do you mean by that?
Well, his father, William Carnegie, was a skilled hand weaver. He represented a craft that had sustained their family and their community for generations. But then the Industrial Revolution arrived.
And with it, the steam-powered loom.
And the steam-powered loom fundamentally crushed his life. Suddenly, the skill that had provided dignity, that provided income, it was worthless.
And watching that happen, seeing a proud craftsman reduced to begging his neighbors for work, that was a traumatic foundational experience for young Andrew.
Absolutely. It instilled in him this incredible fear of scarcity, a terror of being poor and irrelevant. It was a trauma that served as the engine for every single ambitious step he took later in life.
It drove him away from tradition and toward this relentless idea of industrial progress.
And that engine was needed right away, because by 1848, they had no choice but to leave. The family sold their meager possessions. They borrowed a crucial 20 pounds.
Which was a massive debt for them at the time.
A huge debt. And they immigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh was the manufacturing hub of America. It promised work, but it certainly didn't promise any comfort.
No, and the sources really paint a vivid picture of continued hardship. The move didn't magically solve their money problems. His parents struggled to find consistent work, forcing Andrew to drop out of school.
And he had a grand total of 5 years of formal education. That's it.
5 years. His real education then would come on the job, learning the brutal rules of American capitalism.
And those early jobs were a brutal immersion. He started as a coiler in a spinning mill. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for $1.50 a week.
Can you just imagine the physical toll on a teenager?
It's unbelievable. Then he moved on to being a boiler stoker in a factory basement, a job that involved maintaining a fire in a pit, working in darkness and heat for $2 a week. These were the grim realities of industrial labor that he would later impose on thousands of his own workers.
But here's where his natural intellect and his sort of strategic mind really start to emerge. This is his critical break. He lands a job as a messenger boy at the local telegraph office.
And we have to remember, the telegraph back then in the 1840s and 50s was the absolute cutting edge of information technology.
It was the internet of its day.
It really was. It was revolutionary. It collapsed distance and time for communication. And as a messenger boy, Andrew didn't just deliver the paper slips by bike all over Pittsburgh. He used that job to acquire knowledge capital.
So how did he do that? How did he capitalize on just the delivery route?
Well, it wasn't just about speed. It was about familiarity. He made it his mission to memorize the faces, the names, the specific offices of every single business person he delivered a telegram to.
So when he saw them on the street later,
He'd greet them by name. This gave him something unique, an intimate, non-transactional familiarity with the city's entire business community. He was bypassing the social barriers of class and education through sheer effort and memory. He was acquiring connections he never, ever would have gotten from the factory floor.
he turned a simple delivery job into a strategic intelligence gathering operation.
Pretty much. And his technical skills impressed people, too. By the time he was 17, he had perfected his actual telegraph skills.
Right, he had that legendary ability to hear the clicks of the Morse code receiver.
And recite the entire message, names, numbers, quotes without ever writing them down.
It was a bit of a parlor trick, but it was a parlor trick that signaled incredible confidence and an exceptional memory. It showed he was operating on a different intellectual plane than his peers.
And that impressive display, it caught the eye of the right person at the right time, Thomas Scott.
The regional manager for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company.
Which was, as our sources emphasize, the largest corporation in the world at the time.
The biggest company on the planet. And Scott hires Carnegie as his personal telegrapher and private secretary.
The jump is just dizzying. In 5 years, he goes from earning $2 a week shoveling coal in a basement to $35 a month working directly for the head of the largest corporation globally.
That's a massive increase, but as you said before we started, the money wasn't even the most important part.
Not at all. The real value was the mentorship. Scott became more than a boss. He was, in Carnegie's own words, a second father.
Right.
He gave Carnegie this intimate front-row seat on how to manage logistics, capital, and just the sheer scale of a successful, massive industrial business.
It was his real-world MBA.
Exactly. And crucially, it was Scott who introduced him to the engine of true wealth creation. Scott advised Carnegie to stop just earning a salary and start putting that money to work by investing in stocks. This gave him his first critical taste of capitalism.
And that's the transition right there, from a wage earner to a capital owner.
That's it. The foundation of his ambition, that fear of poverty, was now paired with an education in strategic, risk-taking investment.
Okay, let's unpack this financial transition, because this is really where the legend starts to take shape. Here's a guy with a 5th grade education. He's basically a protege to the head of the world's largest company, and he starts developing financial principles that, honestly, they anticipate modern venture capitalism.
His approach was fundamentally radical for a former laborer. You know, most poor working-class people who save money did so conservatively in a bank account.
Right.
Carnegie adopted a core rule that separated him entirely. Don't save money, make it work for you. He saw capital as a workforce of its own. It needed to be deployed, not hoarded.
And his initial actions were staggeringly high risk. I mean, to buy his first real stake 10 shares in the Adams Express Railroad Company, he needed $500. He didn't have it.
No, and the sources confirmed just how high the stakes were. He had to mortgage his parents' house to raise a portion of the funds.
He mortgaged the house.
Can you imagine the emotional weight of that? A small, poor immigrant family putting their only asset, their home, on the line for a highly speculative stock purchase. That level of personal risk, driven by desperation and ambition, it speaks volumes about his conviction.
And the investments in railroads, telegraph companies, eventually oil, They were justified again and again.
Yeah.
He was betting on the future of American infrastructure.
They weren't just justified, they were astronomical successes. Our sources detail one early period where a $50,000 investment turned into $630,000 in just a year and a half.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's an exponential return, and it's achieved through leveraged risk and intelligent market timing. He was capitalizing on the rapid growth of the industries that underpin the nation's expansion.
And he didn't just spend that profit. He established this operating principle. He would only buy new shares using the dividends from his previous ones. So can you explain to the listener why that mechanism is so important for accelerating wealth?
Sure. If you're buying new stock with your salary, your accumulation is linear. It grows slowly, month by month. But if you are using the passive income generated by the existing capital, the dividends, to buy more stock, your wealth grows exponentially.
The capital is funding its own expansion.
Exactly. Carnegie effectively took his salary off the table for investment purposes and let the money he already owned do all the heavy lifting. That's what accelerated his climb out of the working class and into the capitalist elite.
It's also interesting to look at his early motivation. The sources note that it wasn't purely about self-aggrandizement, at least not at first.
No, that's a key point. His first big bonus, $2.50, was immediately given to his mother.
That outward motivation, the desire for his parents to live a decent life, to escape the shame his father experienced, that was a powerful psychological driver for him.
It really was. It's a lot easier to take huge risks and endure stress if you feel like you're doing it for a higher purpose than just, pure luxury.
And this ties directly into the mental framework he adopted, the psychological armor that allowed him to take those massive, calculated risks, what he called the rule of 9/10.
This is a remarkable story. He cites it in his own writings. It comes from an anecdote about an elderly man full of misery and regret who confesses that while his life was long and full of troubles, he eventually realized that 9/10 of those troubles never actually materialized.
And Carnegie just internalized this immediately.
He did. So if you're a high-stakes investor, how does adopting that mindset fundamentally change your behavior?
It frees you from paralysis.
Exactly. The human brain is naturally wired for survival and risk aversion. We imagine catastrophic, worst-case scenarios. The stock fails, the market collapses, my family loses the house.
But if you operate under the certainty that most of those negative possibilities are just imaginary, that they are the 9/10 that never arrive,
You remove the psychological burden of doubt. It allowed Carnegie to move faster and be more decisive than his peers, who were just paralyzed by fear. It's an optimistic but ruthlessly effective mental hack for a capitalist.
he also championed this idea of actively moving the mind from shadow to light. He claimed the ability to forget problems and just smile was more essential than millions of dollars. He saw that mindset was a powerful competitive business tool.
And that mindset was immediately put to the test during the American Civil War, a national crisis, and for him, an opportunity for profit. Carnegie was drafted into the Union Army.
But he was interested in logistics and commerce, not combat.
Right, so he paid the mandated $850 for a substitute to take his place on the battlefield.
Which was totally legal at the time, but for context, $850 was roughly 3 years of his initial salary. It just shows his growing liquidity and his willingness to outsource danger.
And while others were fighting, Carnegie, still leveraging his position with the Pennsylvania Railroad, was noticing these strategic failures in infrastructure. Wooden bridges, which were essential for transporting troops and supplies, were easily burned by both sides.
So he realized there was this desperate, immediate, and high-margin need for iron bridges to replace them.
And that realization led directly to the launch of the Keystone Bridge Company.
And this is where he took the principles he learned from Scott and applied them with just ruthless efficiency. He pioneered this first form of true vertical integration in his business, what our sources call the triad.
Vertical integration is key to controlling cost and speed. Keystone Bridge Company was his first piece, the manufacturing and construction. But the brilliant step was ensuring they owned the means of supply.
They didn't just contract for iron.
No. Carnegie acquired his own iron mills.
So he controlled the supply chain. That meant Keystone wasn't dependent on volatile external mining companies for its raw material. In a high-demand wartime environment, that was an insurmountable competitive advantage. It guaranteed lower material costs and faster delivery times.
And the triad was completed by leveraging his railway connections to monetize the final product. So, 1, the mining company secured the iron ore. 2, Keystone built the bridges using that iron. And 3, a third business would then sell the actual rail lines after the bridge was built.
So each company fed the other. It was a totally integrated, closed-loop system.
He controlled costs, production, and distribution, maximizing his margins at every single stage. This infrastructure of control. This was the blueprint he used for his true empire. Steel.
If the Civil War era was built on iron, the next era, the Gilded Age, would be built on steel. And Carnegie saw this transformation coming. In the late 1850s, early 1870s, he recognized the revolutionary potential of the Bessemer converter.
The Bessemer process was the technological breakthrough that fundamentally transformed the world. Before Bessemer, steel was extremely expensive. It was produced in these small, laborious batches, mainly for specialty items like tools.
Right.
The Bessemer converter, this giant pear-shaped furnace, allowed for the mass production of cheap steel by blowing air through molten iron to burn off impurities.
And steel was exponentially stronger, lighter, and more versatile than iron. It wasn't just for rails and bridges anymore. It gave birth to the first skyscrapers. It revolutionized architecture.
And Carnegie moved with what our sources call lightning speed to pivot his entire operation, successfully building America's first massive steel plants.
His strategy for building this empire was encapsulated in his brutal, cold mantra. Watch the costs, and the profits take care of themselves.
He didn't focus on high prices. He focused on such profound efficiency that his costs were always lower than the competition, which ensured he could always undercut them.
This maniacal focus meant constant innovation. He hired the best engineers in the world, he was constantly adopting the latest technology, and he pushed his employees to the absolute limits of human endurance.
And that's where the cost-cutting directly translated into human suffering. He was notorious for requiring employees to work 364 days a year.
Only resting on the 4th of July.
Just think about the cumulative exhaustion of that schedule year after year in an incredibly dangerous environment.
And he made it very clear where his priorities lay. The machine over the man.
Oh, absolutely. As technology advanced, he sought ways to replace human laborers at every turn. Our sources grimly explain his logic. Machines don't need sleep, they don't ask for raises, and most critically, they don't try to unionize.
It was a pure, unadulterated economic calculation of output versus maintenance.
So he wasn't just a cost accountant. He was a master salesman and a manipulator of, public opinion, customer sentiment. Despite his overwhelming ego, he didn't call his first big steel venture Carnegie Steel.
No, he named his first major plant the J. Edgar Thomson Steel Works.
After the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Which was, of course, the largest potential customer for his steel rails. An incredibly calculated stroke of flattery and public appreciation.
And it paid immediate dividends. Thomson's railroad immediately placed a major initial order of 2,000 steel rails, which virtually guaranteed the mill's success right out of the gate. This practice, publicly showing appreciation and using flattery to cement business relationships, was a long-term strategy that served him really well.
But running the physical operation of a mill, that required a level of brutality that Carnegie, who was increasingly focused on his image as an intellectual and a philosopher, wanted to distance himself from.
Right. And this led him to partner with the perfect executive for the job, Henry Clay Frick.
Frick was the ultimate iron fist, a cutthroat executive known for his singular focus on the bottom line.
And a notoriously anti-labor industrialist. He was ruthless, decisive, and he lacked the moral qualms that Carnegie was beginning to develop, or at least starting to feign.
And Carnegie formalized their partnership not just by bringing him into the management team, but by acquiring a controlling interest in the H.C. Frick Coke Company.
And this was yet another crucial step in vertical integration. It completed the triad for steel production. Coke-refined coal was the necessary fuel for the Bessemer process.
So by controlling the coke supply,
they ensured continuous, cheap fuel, locking out competitors who had to buy coke at market prices. Together, Carnegie, the visionary, and Frick, the executor, they became an unstoppable, cutthroat industrial force.
And to understand the extent of their ruthlessness, we have to look at the story of how they crushed one of their competitors, the Duquesne Works. It's a perfect case study in monopolistic tactics and economic war.
It's industrial espionage and psychological warfare all rolled into one. Frick and Carnegie, they spread a rumor throughout the industry that Duquesne's mill was producing defective steel.
And our sources are very clear. The rumor was not true. The steel was fine.
But in business, the perception of risk is often more powerful than the reality.
Carnegie then leveraged his lack of formal education and used it to his advantage by using this complicated technical jargon to confuse his customers. He claimed that Duquesne's rails lacked homogeneity.
And that detail is so important. Homogeneity means uniformity, that the metal structure is consistent without internal flaws. It's crucial for structural integrity. But the vast majority of railroad managers and customers didn't have the metallurgical knowledge to verify this.
They just heard a scary, complex word used by the world's leading steel producer.
It sounded scientific and terrifying, and it successfully frightened off customers who worried they were getting a structurally inferior product. That slowed Duquesne sales dramatically and drained their cash flow.
And to expedite the kill, Carnegie and Frick immediately undercut Duquesne's prices, selling rails at a loss if necessary, just to guarantee that Duquesne couldn't maintain market share.
So they were squeezed from both sides, from the demand side with the rumor and the price side with the predatory pricing. Duquesne's finances just collapsed.
And within 2 years, Duquesne was ruined. They had no choice but to sell to Carnegie at a bargain price. The message was unmistakable. Carnegie Steel would achieve market domination by any means necessary. Ethics be damned.
This relentless drive for cost reduction and market domination led, inevitably, to a massive human price tag. While Carnegie was busy writing essays about the gospel of wealth and building his public image, he was simultaneously engaging in what historians correctly label his greatest hypocrisy.
The systematic crushing of his labor force.
Exactly. He publicly advocated for better conditions, for increased wages. He was frequently penning articles about the dignity of the laborer, but privately he was slashing paychecks and doing almost nothing to make his factories safer.
His attempt to rebrand himself as this enlightened industrialist was directly undermined by the necessity of high labor costs, which were just incompatible with his low-cost strategy.
And this internal conflict led to a calculated strategic decision. He decided to distance himself physically from the inevitable fallout. He traveled to Scotland, his ancestral homeland, and used Frick as his scapegoat, his lieutenant, to execute the dirty work.
He knew that cutting the wages of 10,000 already frustrated, low-paid workers would lead to unrest, and he wanted no direct association with the violence.
And the reality of working in his mills, fueled by that cost-cutting obsession, was horrific. Workers themselves grimly nicknamed the Carnegie plants the death trap.
The standard work environment was a grueling 12 hours a day, often 7 days a week, with occasional mandatory double shifts. And the wages were poverty wages around $10 a week.
Which was barely enough to cover rent and food for a family. There was no safety net, no retirement, no insurance, nothing.
But beyond the hours and the pay, the danger itself was just staggering. The processes were still incredibly primitive and chaotic. Workers were constantly exposed to intense heat, noxious fumes, and the tremendous danger of operating massive, unshielded machinery.
Our sources detail the horrific reality. I mean, men frequently fell into cauldrons of molten metal, vaporizing instantly. They were crushed by immense machinery or incinerated by sudden explosions when water interacted with molten iron.
The constant noise and heat led to profound exhaustion and mistakes.
And those mistakes were often fatal.
It's hard to contextualize the danger of that era, but the statistics are chilling. In 1898, industry-wide, 9% of all steelworkers died on the job.
9%. That means 1 out of every 11 men in the industry would not make it through the year.
The men were entirely replaceable. The machinery and the output were not. It reflects Carnegie's foundational philosophy.
And this brutal system led directly to the breaking point in 1892 at the Homestead Steelworks just outside Pittsburgh. Tensions were incredibly high, exacerbated by the widening wealth gap. I mean, Carnegie was the richest man in the world while his men couldn't afford a doctor.
The workers knew their shrinking voice could only be heard through collective bargaining. They were represented by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the most powerful unions of the day.
And despite Carnegie Steel posting record profits during the preceding year, Frick, following Carnegie's explicit desire to break the union, demanded drastic changes.
Reduced income, increased production quotas, and longer hours.
When the union refused to accept the terms, Frick locked out all 10,000 employees.
And his strategic plan was clear. Eliminate the union entirely, open the mill with replacement, non-union immigrant workers who were willing to accept the lower pay and higher risk, and then blacklist the skilled workers who had dared to organize.
And Frick didn't take any chances. He immediately turned the mill into a genuine fortress. It earned the nickname Fort Frick. He erected a 12-foot fence around the property topped with razor-sharp barbed wire and equipped with rifle ports.
And the town, which was composed entirely of mill workers, watched this preparation with just dread.
The situation escalated to its final bloody climax when Frick hired an external force to enforce the lockout, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency.
Essentially a private army for hire.
Exactly. 300 agents hired to escort the strikebreakers onto the property.
So on July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived on barges via the Monongahela River under the cover of darkness. They were hoping to land before dawn.
But the strikers had been tipped off. As the barges attempted to land, they were met by thousands of angry armed strikers lining the riverbanks.
A shot rang out from the shore, and who fired first is still contested, and the resulting pitched battle, known to history as the Homestead Massacre, began. It was a terrifying all-day confrontation that quickly descended into chaos.
The strikers poured oil onto the water and set it alight. They attempted to blow up the barges with homemade cannons. They exchanged fire with the trapped Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were ultimately forced to surrender after hours of intense fighting.
The cost of the battle was horrifying. 9 factory workers and 7 Pinkertons were left dead, with hundreds more injured. The local authorities were completely incapable of restoring order, forcing the governor of Pennsylvania to intervene.
Yes, Governor Robert Pattison ordered 8,500 state militia troops to the scene. It was essentially a state occupation. Under the protection of the military, the factory was reopened with non-union labor.
And the consequences for the working class were devastating and long-lasting. The union was crushed. It was effectively eliminated from the steel industry for decades.
Many key strikers were blacklisted, unable to find work anywhere in the industry again. And those who returned did so under Frick's terms. Lower pay, longer hours, and the same horrific, unsafe working conditions. The system had won.
And Carnegie, safe and sound in Scotland, upon receiving the telegram confirming that the factory was secured and, most importantly, the union was broken, sent his infamous cable back to Frick.
Life worth living again.
Life worth living again. That quote sealed his reputation. It marked him not just as a harsh industrialist, but as a moral coward who sanctioned bloodshed and exploitation while maintaining a safe, physical, and ethical distance. He had won the battle, but his public image was forever stained by the blood spilled at Homestead. That brings us to the final and most controversial phase of Carnegie's life, the attempt at redemption. By 1901, he's nearing age 70. And he was tired. He had the money, he had the power, but he also had the moral stain of Homestead and just the constant grind of the business world. He was open to selling.
And he sold to the only man capable of buying an empire of that size, J.P. Morgan. Morgan wanted to consolidate the American steel industry into a massive trust, and he needed Carnegie Steel, the most efficient component, to do it. The negotiation was legendary, settled with a handshake for $480 million.
That sale immediately made Andrew Carnegie the single richest man in the world at the time. But he promptly retired. He dedicated himself 100% to philanthropy, adhering to a rule he'd set for himself decades earlier.
Right. He would not leave a single dollar to his family, aside from a small annuity for his wife.
And this commitment wasn't spontaneous. It was rooted in his famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth.
In it, he argued that the wealthy had a moral duty to use their fortunes for the public good. He famously stated, "The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced." He believed capital accumulation in the first half of one's life was necessary, but capital distribution in the second half was morally obligatory.
But the key here is the type of giving he championed. He wasn't a fan of simple, direct charity. He felt it created dependency.
Right. Instead, he championed what he called paternalistic philanthropy, creating institutions, or ladders, as he called them, for the aspiring to climb and self-improve. He saw himself as the wise steward of the public's money.
The logic being, since he, through his superior intellect and efficiency, had proven himself capable of accumulating the wealth, he believed he was uniquely qualified to dispense it in ways that would yield the greatest societal benefit.
It was giving, but it was giving rooted in control.
The scale of that giving, though, regardless of the motivation, remains staggering. He gave away over $350 million, which translates to many, many billions in modern currency.
And given his own trajectory, having only 5 years of formal schooling, he had this profoundly emotional connection to libraries. He credited access to books with his own success. He believed that access to knowledge was the ultimate equalizer in a democratic society.
And he didn't just fund a handful. He funded, built, and stocked over 2,500 libraries worldwide.
What's particularly fascinating, and it's often cited by his defenders as proof of genuine altruism, is how discreet he often was about this generosity. Our sources indicate his name was displayed on fewer than 500 of those libraries. He often yielded to the local community's preference.
And his philanthropic portfolio was vast. It went way beyond libraries. He funded institutions like Carnegie Mellon University, which fused technical and artistic education. And he established the Peace Palace at The Hague in the Netherlands.
Seeking to promote international arbitration and end the scourge of war. A profound aspiration for a man who profited immensely from military conflicts.
And of course, there's Carnegie Hall, which he built in 1891. It was originally named the Music Hall.
It was renamed after his death, not at his request, further cementing this image of him as a quiet benefactor who only sought to uplift culture and education.
But we have to return to the critic's core argument.
Sure.
The juxtaposition of his wealth acquisition and his giving is just jarring.
It really is.
Many historians argue that the money used for these philanthropic institutions could have provided safer working conditions, higher wages, or basic health care for his workers in the mills before they ever needed a public library to climb the ladder of poverty he helped create.
And this is precisely where the concept of image laundering or art washing comes in. The timing and the scale of his giving immediately following the devastation of Homestead and the huge public backlash are highly suspicious. He needed to repair his and Pittsburgh's reputation.
And we see this most cynically in the public art he commissioned, specifically these monumental murals like the Crowning of Labor, which were painted between 1905 and 1908 in the Carnegie Institute.
These murals romantically glorified the dignity of labor. They depicted the common steelworker not as this miserable, disposable drone, but as a heroic, muscular, dignified figure, a mythological representation of the American dream.
But wasn't the art itself beautiful and culturally enriching? Can't we just appreciate the cultural legacy regardless of where the money came from?
Well, you can appreciate the art, certainly, but the context can't be ignored. The man whose company actively fought, suppressed, and endangered those exact laborers was now paying vast sums of money for paintings that glorified them.
It's a classic example of using cultural patronage art and education to actively distract from profound ethical lapses and industrial violence. It's an attempt to redefine his legacy through the cultural high ground.
And despite all the giving, the universities, the peace initiatives, his fundamental labor philosophy remained anti-union until the end of his life.
Why was that stance so entrenched?
Because organized labor challenged his absolute authority. Carnegie fundamentally believed in his own exceptionalism. He was the wise man who knew best. Collective action and worker organization, they challenged his vision, which held that he, the superior capitalist, had the sole right to decide what was best for society and how his wealth should be dispensed.
The union represented a sharing of power,
Which he could not abide.
So the central paradox remains. Was his colossal philanthropy a genuine penance, an attempt to atone for the human cost and the stain on his reputation? Or was it merely the most ambitious, most successful, and most comprehensive public relations campaign in the history of capitalism, designed to transform a ruthless robber baron into a worldly saint? As we conclude this deep dive, we are left then with the two Andrew Carnegies that our sources present. There's the visionary, the immigrant who overcame trauma and innovation to fundamentally transform America into an industrial power and who believed deeply in education.
And then there's the tyrant, the hypocrite who orchestrated bloodshed, exploited his labor force, and presided over death trap mills, all for profit.
He was, without question, a profound contradiction. A figure who leveraged the Industrial Revolution to build a world of soaring cities and intellectual opportunity for many.
But only by creating a living hell for many others. His story forces us to look squarely at the foundations of American success and ask whether a fortune built on such suffering and cruelty can ever truly be washed clean by subsequent generosity.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. When we weigh the good against the bad, the vast, undeniable, widespread benefit of 2,500 public libraries, the founding of a major university, the Peace Palace at The Hague, does that utilitarian good outweigh the specific, localized, and tragic human cost? The loss of life, the shattered lives resulting from the Homestead massacre. What is the moral calculus of industrial progress when you realize the steel for those powering libraries was forged in the blood of the men who built his empire?